What if the problem isn't that you lost your voice, but it just got buried under everyone else's?
What if the problem isn't that you lost your voice, but that it got buried under everyone else's? Buried under expectations, responsibilities, emotional survival, strong personalities, keeping the peace, trying not to disappoint people. And after enough years of that, it can become surprisingly difficult to tell what's actually you under all that noise. Lately, I've been thinking a lot about that, about how many women slowly disconnect from themselves without fully realizing it. Not because they're weak, not because they don't have opinions, but because they became so accustomed to adjusting themselves emotionally around everyone else that eventually their own voice became harder to hear clearly. I remember feeling this a lot as a child at big family gatherings. My dad came from a very large family, so when everybody got together, there were constantly conversations happening everywhere at once. People talking loudly, laughing, telling stories, opinions, emotions, energy everywhere. And I remember loving my family, but also leaving those gatherings feeling completely overwhelmed, almost disoriented, like my nervous system had absorbed too much at once. And looking back now, I think that was one of the first times I started noticing how easy it was for me to lose connection with myself in loud, emotional environments. Not because anyone was doing anything wrong, but because when you're very observant and very emotionally attuned, other people's energy can become incredibly loud. And sometimes your own inner voice gets harder to hear underneath all of it. What happens when emotional adaptation becomes so automatic that parts of you slowly get locked away? Reading the room, anticipating reactions, keeping things smooth, knowing when to stay quiet, knowing when to soften themselves. And sometimes these patterns become so automatic that they stop feeling like adaptation at all. They just start feeling like personality. You become easygoing, understanding, flexible, low maintenance. But underneath that, sometimes there's exhaustion. Because constantly adjusting yourself around everyone else's energy takes energy. And over time, you can slowly lose touch with your own emotional clarity. I noticed this really strongly when I started working in a very fast-paced environment a few years ago. At certain times of the day, there would be a lot of people crowded into one room, all trying to finish tasks quickly before the shift ended. People talking, supervisors giving directions, questions being asked, noise everywhere, movement everywhere. And I remember realizing how much energy I was putting into reading the room, trying to figure out who's stressed, who needs help, who should I avoid right now, who's frustrated, who needs reassurance. And without even realizing it, I would start holding parts of myself back while I tried to emotionally navigate everyone else first. And I think that's one of the ways emotional adaptation can quietly happen. You become so focused on managing the emotional environment around you that you slowly stop noticing yourself inside of it. And honestly, I didn't even fully realize I was doing that until much later. I think one of the strangest parts of this process is how subtle other people's voice can live inside your head. not in some dramatic way, just quietly. Sometimes somebody has such a strong certainty, such strong opinions, such strong emotional energy that you slowly start filtering yourself through them without even realizing it. And one day, you suddenly notice, I don't even know if this thought is actually mine. I remember realizing this years ago in a very ordinary moment. I remember years ago after working in an environment where there was a very strong authority figure. He had strong opinions about life, about people, about what was right and wrong. And he spoke with those opinions with so much certainty that after a while, I stopped questioning a lot of it. And what's interesting is, I don't think I consciously decided these are now my beliefs. I think it happened much more quietly than that. Slowly, subtly, just through the constant exposure to someone else's certainty. And years later, I remember looking back and thinking, wait, did I actually believe those things? Or had I slowly absorbed someone else's voice because it felt easier, safer, or more accepted at the time? And I think moments like that can really wake you up to how easily strong personalities can become louder inside your head than your own inner knowing. And what struck me afterward wasn't really the situation itself. It was realizing how easily I had adapted myself internally around someone else's emotional presence. I think a lot of women do this without realizing it, especially women who spent years trying to maintain emotional harmony around difficult, critical, controlling, or highly expressive people. Most people don't lose themselves all at once. I think it happens very quietly, little moments, ignoring discomfort, second guessing intuition, talking yourself out of your feelings, staying in situations that don't feel right, automatically assuming everyone else probably knows better. And eventually, your own internal voice can start sounding unfamiliar. Not gone, just quiet. And I think that's why so many women reach a certain point in life and suddenly feel disconnected from themselves. Not because they became someone else overnight, but because they spent years prioritizing everyone else's emotional reality first. I think one of the ways this happened most strongly for me was in a relationship with someone who had a strong personality. He spoke with a lot of certainty, a lot of confidence, a lot of conviction. And over time, his perspective slowly started feeling louder than my own. It didn't happen all at once. That's the part I think people misunderstand sometimes. These kinds of shifts often happen very gradually. Little moments. Being told something should be obvious. Feeling like your reactions are wrong. Second guessing your instincts. Starting to believe someone else's version of reality more than your own internal response. And eventually, I realized something painful. I had become disconnected from my own voice. Not because I didn't have one, but because I had spent so much time adapting myself around someone else's certainty that I'd stopped fully trusting my own thoughts, feelings, and perceptions. And honestly, I think that kind of disconnection can happen much more quietly than people realize. Maybe finding your voice again doesn't happen in one huge dramatic moment. What if it starts quietly? Sometimes it looks like pausing before automatically agreeing. letting yourself dislike something without explaining why, sitting with your own feelings before asking everyone what they think, paying attention to exhaustion, paying attention to resentment, paying attention to what brings you alive again. And honestly, sometimes finding your voice again isn't even about speaking more. Sometimes it's about hearing yourself more clearly. And honestly, I think part of finding my voice again happened very quietly. Not as some huge breakthrough moment. Not in some dramatic declaration. It happened one day when the room was completely silent. No music, no television, no conversation, no distractions. And I remember sitting there quietly and noticing myself sigh out loud. Almost like my nervous system was finally exhaling. And I remember putting my hands on my heart, breathing in the silence, and feeling this quiet sense of gratitude. Not really with words, more with presence. And I think moments like that made me realize how disconnected I had become from myself for a long time. Because when everything else finally became quiet, I could hear myself again. Maybe that's where self-trust begins. Not in becoming louder, not in becoming fearless, but in slowly reconnecting with yourself again. I think many women spend years becoming deeply attuned to everyone else's emotions, everyone else's needs, everyone else's comfort. And maybe part of this stage of life is learning to include yourself in that awareness too. Maybe your voice never disappeared completely. Maybe it's simply been waiting underneath all the noise. And maybe one of the most powerful things we can do is begin listening to ourselves again.